Okay, so welcome to the first segment of the lab environment setup. And first of all, we're going to start with the virtualization platform. I chose to go with VMware Workstation in this segment because I had a license. VMware Workstation is a paid license, so it costs about $200 to get started. It's a very nice platform that you can run on a workstation. I'm using currently the latest, I believe, 15.5. And basically, if you have a key that enables you to run with VMware Workstation or you want to purchase it, I do recommend it. However, there is a free alternative called Virtualbox, which I've used for quite a long time, and I can also recommend it as well. Regardless of which platform you'll choose, I'm going to go over VMware. A lot of the things will be applicable to VMware through Virtualbox, and I will cover Virtualbox in a later video if they'll be required or asked by a lot of people. In general, I'm going to do a quick overview on virtualization, explain a few concepts about that, and then we'll move forward towards the actual installation. There is a lab environment already in place here, but I'm going to build a new lab environment as part of the videos, and we'll see how I'll add additional servers to the mix. So getting started, first of all, virtualization is a quite mature concept. The idea is to run virtual machines inside an environment on a physical host. Those are basically the main terms you'll hear. A physical host is basically the host machine, and the guests are basically the virtual machines that are running on that host. Beyond the concept of creating segments of resources that each virtual machine is using, we're talking about running a software or an operating system in a virtual space that basically allows you to run multiple operating systems running on the same box, same physical hardware. Not only that, you're also able to create multiple connections between them virtually via virtual network in order to simulate and facilitate multiple use cases of traffic and networking. This is a very brief overview of why you should use virtualization in the lab. In general, it allows you to create a very compact environment. It will take you otherwise multiple servers to facilitate. This is already straightforward practice in IT world, that you have a very large virtual environment. So it's not like the old days where you had multiple physical servers connected to switches. It's a lot more virtual nowadays. You can have one machine with hundreds of virtual servers, and everything is connected in the backend logically. So I'm not going to dive into much more detailed concept of virtualization. I'm going to cover enough in order for you to be able to configure the lab and understand it. The main concept of a virtual environment is basically adding virtual machines to the environment. Obviously, when the environment begins, you start by seeing it empty, and then you can add virtual machine as you go. So for starters, when you create a virtual machine, there's a lot of configuration steps involved. Some of them can be done straightforward, some of them are more complex. I'm going to cover adding a new virtual machine to the environment step by step. And this is where I'm going to cover a few of these topics when we do it. So first of all, typical or custom. I do recommend custom, and I'll give a few pointers why in a moment. When you go with the custom installation, first of all, you need to choose the compatibility level of what you're creating. It's pretty much VMware specific. I don't believe it exists in VirtualBox, but the main idea is that you're creating a virtual machine based on a specific class. If you create a virtual machine on 15.5, obviously you won't be able to run it on anything other than Workstation 15.5 or Fusion 11X, which I have no idea what it is. And the main idea is that if you know for a fact that you're going to move these machines later to a ES6 machine, which is the server class virtualization of VMware, or an older version of virtual server, you better select other versions, and then you can see the compatibility level. Right now, there's really no reason, because I'm going to keep all the lab in this machine, so I'm going to keep it with Virtual 5.5. This is where you need to select how you're going to install the guest operating system. And for the sake of almost every use case, I will recommend going with install operating system later. The reason being is that if you will select the installer image right now, you'll see it pops something called operating system will be installed using easy install. And this is a very error-prone concept. There's a lot of tweaks in terms of easy install, and a lot of things you need to be aware of. Sometimes it is calibrated to be a specific OS, and then it doesn't match, and then you have a failed installation. Sometimes there's all kinds of hardware failure or things that are missing that are preventing the installation from taking place. I would strongly argue that there is really no reason not to go with I will install manually later, unless you're doing something very specific. And even though these options allow you to have a very easier experience, smoother experience in the installation, it's often leading to the other case of problems. So I would go with custom. Once you go past this step, you're basically giving some options to specify what is the machine that you're going to install. Based on class, it gives you the very big list of options. Why does it matter what you pick here? It really doesn't matter that much. All it means is the virtualization platform will try to select all the next settings according to what you select. So if I pick, for example, Windows 10, and I'll click next, it will try to assign beyond the name, which is just the name and the location. It will try to set up all the settings, like the BIOS settings, or if it's UEFI. All of the setting will be configured to be as close match to what you selected. So Windows 10, it goes with 1 processor, 2 virtual cores. If I'm going to select, let's say for example, Windows Server 2016, you'll see that it'll give me UEFI as the default. It'll give me 2 cores with 2 processor with 1 core. So there's all kinds of setting and tweaks that go with the selection of the operating system. It really doesn't matter. So I'm going to select manually all the settings afterwards, so it doesn't matter what I'll pick. I will go with Windows 10 because I'm planning to install a Windows 10 client on this specific installation. I click on next. I select the location where the data will be saved. I'm going to keep it here. I'm just going to rename it as like Windows 10 client free. And then I'm going to select next. It'll go set up with BIOS, which is the default for Windows 10. It's good enough for me. 1 virtual processor, 2 virtual cores, that's the setting. That's also pretty good. And then in terms of memory, it will specify 1 gig of RAM. I usually recommend going with 1.5 for your clients, 1.536 if you want to be precise. And the idea is that you're going to specify more memory to the clients because you're going to spend more time working with them as a client. And it really hurts you if they're slow. So I go with that. This is the first setting that comes into play that has a lot of depth in it. What kind of networking? And I will cover networking in a moment by explaining the virtual switch. But the main idea is that there are 3 settings that are relevant, or 4 do not use. Basically, do not use means it will be an isolated, disconnected environment. It really makes no sense because you're creating a virtual machine. You only do it if you have like a lab where you want to run malware or things that you want to completely isolate from the network. And even then, you're probably going to use with the host-only networking. But the 2 options at the top are very important. Option 1, which is the default, use network address NAT. Network address translation. This means that the machine itself is not really connected to the outside world. It's piggybacking on the physical box network card, and basically you have some kind of a tunnel that takes your traffic, masks them as the host traffic, and nats them out, and then it's a virtual environment. It's a virtual connection that is not a straightforward connection to the outside world. When you use this will be a mask using the virtual network cards, which I'll show you in a moment. And you're going to use an IP range that doesn't exist on the physical box or in your physical network. This is the recommended default. I don't know why, because it really makes no sense to me. I would argue that using bridge network is the best in any scenario. Definitely for what I'm going to explain now with a real world lab. A bridge interface basically means that each one of the virtual machines will facilitate a virtual card that is connected to the normal network. It's going to be as close of experience as working with another physical machine. And also it gives you the highest level of flexibility in terms of manipulation of traffic to the internet, to the local area network, and also getting services from outside the virtual box to go in. This is the recommended setting when I do the labs. I will go over in more detail later, but I would go with that if you want to build a real lab that will give you the closest experience to real world. Moving forward, this is all kinds of settings that are related to the virtual hardware and the drivers that will be used. You can keep the default in most use cases. The only reason you would go and change them is if you have problems or issues when you run them. This is something that is common for all kinds of older operating system or operating system that have all kind of requirements. I'm going to leave the default here for the IO component. I'm going to leave the default for the disk type. And I'm going to create a new virtual disk to basically facilitate this new operating system. This is where you'll be able to specify the maximum disk size. And I specified it at 40 gigs. And this is where you have another choice whether to allocate all the disks now, which means you'll create all the disk will be completely populated. So you'll basically be creating a 40 gigabyte file on the disk. And the alternative is to not allocate it now, which is the default. And then basically the disk will grow as you copy more and more data towards the machine. This is where it's important to understand that if you're planning to do a lot of copy and pasting and deleting of files, this will be a very bad practice in terms of defragmentation. It'll create a very large file because it can only expand and not shrink. And you'll need to actually defrag the disk if you want it to shrink. So even though you specify 40 gigs here, this is the virtual guest hard disk. So it will be maximum 40 gig for the guest. But the physical the physical file on the disk might grow to beyond 40 gigabytes, and you'll need to defrag it and maintain it. And there's all kinds of performance consideration to take into heart. Unless you're using SSD or a fast disk system behind it, and then it's less relevant. I would still recommend that you don't go with allocate full disk space, even if it's a lab. And if you see that your disks are starting to be very big, you'll just shut down the machines and defrag them. This is not a production environment, so obviously it's possible. And this will save you space in the short term and also in the long term, unless you do a very specific operation with the lab. This is an option here to split it to multiple files. When you're going with small disk below 100, 200 gigs, there's no real reason to split them. There's no real benefit or gain. I would recommend it storing on a single file. If you bypass the 200 gig disk, I would start arguing that it maybe is better to split them. Preferably, you don't split them for maintenance and for administration purposes, but it doesn't really matter for the lab because all of the machines will be under 50 or 60 gigs. So we can go with a single file. Next step is just the name where we'll put the disk file. I'm going to specify the default location. Let's say like this. I can specify the default location here. It doesn't really matter. And then you have an option to see all the summary, and finish, you'll create the machine. So before I'll go into the next step of an installation of the OS, I want to talk about the virtual switch and what's going on with the networking in this environment. So by clicking File and clicking Edit, more like it, and then the Virtual Network Editor, we're able to see the virtual switch. And it starts with a little bit of less data than you expect, and everything is grayed out because you need to run it as admin. So by running it as admin, it will pop up and show you the full information. So what are we seeing here? Basically, we're seeing the three types as they mapped to virtual network cards. VMnet 8 is the NAT, VMnet 1 is the host-only network, and VMnet 0 is the bridge interface. And if you're very meticulous, you'll see that you're seeing the name of the external connection that the bridge interface will use. So what does this mean? First of all, let's open the network card on my machine. You can see here in terms of the virtual interface that exists, you can see VMnet 1, VMnet 8, which if you remember corresponds with the host only and NAT. And you don't see the VMnet 0, which is bridge. Why don't we see it? Because it's actually mapped to an external connection, this one, Intel Dual Band Wireless, which is my wireless connection. You can see here, this is my wireless connection, this is the name, and it's mapped 1-to-1. If you have, this is where you're going to talk about troubleshooting step 1. So first of all, you need to make sure that if you're working with bridged, the external connection is mapped to the right external connection. Let's assume your laptop has a network card that has a physical port and Wi-Fi. This needs to map to the one that is actually working. So when you're bridging it, it says you will connect the VMs directly to the external connection using what? And then you need to select what is the network card. And this is where it's very important to have an automatic is the default, by the way, and I would not recommend it. I would recommend going with actually the physical card that you want to choose. It's much more reliable and something that you should consider. One more thing that I want you to see, when you select one of the default one, first of all, when you select the bridge one, it has no IP setting by default. It leverages the DHCP in the network. You can specify, but if you select the virtual one, you see here that there are segments. At the bottom, there is a DHCP that is collecting and that is distributing IP configuration to every virtual machine on this environment. And you can see that by default, it goes with subnets here and here. This is something that if you're building a lab that requires very heavy netting, If you'll take a look here at the card itself, you'll see that it's obtaining automatically. And if you want to change it to manually to have other IP settings, this is where you would go to dead setting and not change it manually in this card, because it creates all kinds of problems with the network. So you would need to go towards the network setting as I showed you here, and then specify the changes that you would like to change on the network interface itself here on the subnet range you're collecting and distributing. This is important for troubleshooting if you have all kinds of reason to use NAT or host only. So moving along from the network, there's not much troubleshooting to do other than understanding that you're seeing bridged, you're seeing the external connection that you're using, and you're not seeing any funky configuration in terms of networking that doesn't make sense. And sometimes there are issues there. This is the first step to troubleshoot if you're not getting the network connectivity you expect.